I woke up in the hospital and I had this moment where I needed to change my life and do what really mattered most to me, and that was writing. Every single day when I throw things out, I'm filled with anxiety. Well, in some ways, keeping things, hanging on to our stuff, is a repudiation of capitalism, right? Not to go out and buy the next thing and to be trapped in that cycle.
Being an artist can be a heck of a ride, but you're not alone. On Journey of the Art, we tell inspiring stories of artists and chat with those who support us on this path. I'm your host, Lola Opataya, writer, editor, singer, and all-round lover of words. Come with me on the journey. Hello and welcome to Journey of the Art. Today we're going to discuss hoarding and the idea of ownership in the novel Keep by Jenny Haysom. Keep tells the moving story of two homestagers and their client Harriet, an elderly poet who is reluctant to sell her home and let go of the paraphernalia of her life. As these stagers find ways to carefully declutter Harriet's home, they find that they themselves must attend to the clutter in their own lives. Keep navigates how, why, and what we keep and lose, and the big question, what is the most important thing? Keep is out now with House of Anansi Press. And my guest and author of Keep is Jenny Haysom. Jenny was born in England and raised in Nova Scotia. She has a master's degree in English literature from the University of Ottawa and has served as prose editor for Arc Poetry magazine. Her writing has been published widely in places like CV2, Ducey, The Fiddlehead, The New Quarterly, and The Walrus, as well as in chapbook form, Blinding Afternoons. Dividing the Wayside, her first full-length collection of poems, was shortlisted for the Gerald Lampert Memorial Award and won the Archibald Lampern Award. Welcome, Jenny.
Oh, thank you, Lola. It's lovely to be here chatting with you.
Thank you so much for doing this. I'm so delighted to talk about your book, Keep. I'm just going to put that up there, which I received from House of Anansi Press. I really, really enjoyed reading this book. I could not stop reading it. It's not all the time that I find a book that I even just set aside and come back to later. I really could not put this book down. It was so moving. And like I was telling you before we started this conversation, it spoke very, very much to me, especially as I watch my own parents get older. So thank you so much for writing this book.
Oh, well, thank you for reading it.
It was a delight. It was a delight. Well, before we begin the conversation, here's a reminder that Journey of the Art is available wherever you get your podcasts. So feel free to listen on the go, follow the show, and leave a comment. This really helps to boost our visibility so more folks like you can discover us. Also, I'd love to connect with you on Instagram, so please follow the show at Journey of the Art Pod. Okay, Jenny, why don't you start us off by sharing a bit about how you came to write this book?
It's a long story. I spent years writing it. First of all, I used to work as a home stager very briefly when I was a young mother, and I knew it was a somewhat traumatizing experience, I'll admit, and I knew I wanted to revisit it in my writing when I had enough detachment from some of the things I'd gone through. In 2017, I started sort of sketching out the first chapter. The writer Rachel Cusk was teaching a workshop at Banff, and I really wanted to participate. It was a fiction workshop. And in order to be considered, you had to have a first chapter of a novel. So I decided I was going to write one, and I decided it was going to be somehow connected to this experience I'd had staging homes,
Right.
which was a somewhat traumatizing experience because I was constantly dealing with broken people,
Right.
vulnerable people who needed my help because they were dealing with some sort of life-changing event, like a death in the family, or divorce, or
Right.
a health issue. And so I found it was a weird combination of staging and social work.
Mm.
And it ended quite badly for me. I won't go into those details, but I will say that I couldn't immediately explore them in writing.
Mm.
So when I applied to do this workshop at Banff with Rachel Cusk, I only made the short list. I didn't actually get in, and I was extremely disappointed.
Oh.
And yeah. So writing has so many moments like this, moments of rejection and
Yeah. Oh,
disappointment.
yeah.
And I think we have to just constantly pick ourselves up after
Yes.
something unfortunate happens. And in this case, I was so sad about not making it, but I realized that I had something really important on my hands, and that was the
Mm.
beginning of a novel. I had this first chapter, and the first chapter sort of came to me and is very much the one you read, Lola. It wasn't changed, or hasn't
Wow.
changed much, but
Wow.
the story itself did change over many years of writing and rewriting. um, I'd had a lot of experience writing poetry, but I didn't really know much about writing fiction.
Mm.
So I cut my teeth on this manuscript,
Wow.
and yeah, it took me probably about 5 years to
Wow.
get it right, before it went out on submission.
Wow. Wow,
Mhm.
that's quite the journey. And I
Yeah.
really do love this the writing of the book as well. It's so intimate, I would say. The way you're able to draw us into each character. I don't think that there was any character that I felt I didn't know enough of, just because of the care and the intentionality with which you zoomed in on each of their lives. So thank you so much for sharing this. I don't think I've heard or seen or know anyone who has been a homestager. So this is a very interesting perspective that you share with us, of people who help people to pack up their lives, right? And in a way erase their memories and erase their lives. But doing it so lovingly, so gently, and also dealing with, the stuff that they're going through as well. So the book talks about the things that are kept, but there's also this idea of the things that we keep that aren't ours.
Mhm.
Like Harriet's poems, which Eleanor and the others get to decide on, which one might argue is far from what Harriet wished for the poems, and the unceded Algonquin territories, which came to be governed by settlers. And I love this other side of the coin, in which the reader sees that not everything should be kept. Was this something that you were intentional about? And can you talk a little bit about this?
Well, it's so interesting, Lola, that you point out that Harriet might have been uneasy about her poems being recovered and kept and possibly published.
Mm.
And maybe she didn't know exactly herself uh, how she wanted these poems to wind up.
Right.
I mean, she was unable to destroy them herself, and they provided her with great comfort, even in their material form, in that little desk
Yeah.
in her daughter's room. Um, so that she was hanging on to them, but she wasn't publishing them. and
Yeah.
and I think that's because in the novel I explored this idea. She wanted them to be free from ego,
Mm.
so they were little acts of recompense. um, but yes, your question about us hanging on to things that we shouldn't hang on to, I mean, that's a complicated problem, isn't it?
Yeah, it certainly is.
Yeah. Did Eleanor and Jacob and Lawrence have the right to recover those poems? Possibly, I think so. I knew that Harriet didn't want them published in her time, sort of in the way that Emily Dickinson, she collected and gathered her work, but it wasn't published
Right.
for the most part in her
Right.
day. But I'm not sure how Harriet would have felt about her work seeing the light of day. Now, the artifacts that Harriet hangs on to in the story, that's a whole other story. I think they're reflective of years of dispossession. Let me just say that when Harriet does find those arrowheads in her garden, she takes them to a museum, and the museum admires them and identifies them and explains them to Harriet, but then puts them away in a sliding drawer.
Yeah, that was so sad. That was so sad.
Yeah. So I'm, museums are interesting places because they're places which certainly have evolved out of Western notions of collection, what they used to call cabinets of curiosity. And they're sort of problematic for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
For example, in many indigenous cultures, they don't share our ideas about preserving and curating and collecting in the same way. They don't put objects and artifacts that are of importance to them in plexiglass boxes. They tend to allow these artifacts of theirs to disintegrate in place like actual ancestors' bodies. So there's a difference there. They don't try to hang on to things. And I'm very much a person who tries to sort of fight my impulses to collect and keep and gather and hoard. And yet at the same time, we were talking about this when I was having trouble setting up the technology here. And I was outraged by forced obsolescence and the fact that we need to keep replacing our computers and our laptops and things so that they work. Well, in some ways, keeping things, hanging on to our stuff is a repudiation of capitalism, right? Not to go out and buy the next thing and to be trapped in that cycle. So I wouldn't want to say one thing about keeping or one thing about letting go. It's a complicated matter. And not all objects and items are the same.
Absolutely.
I mean, we'd like to think that art and poetry should be kept, right? Because there are readers down the road who might benefit from Harriet's poems. And there's something wonderfully immortalizing about art and poetry and the written word. And we find great comfort in that we can have a conversation between generations, right? Yeah. So I don't want to say that keeping things is bad or good. It's neither.
Absolutely.
It's a state, it's a condition that we're in. I will say this, though. I will say for sure that every single day when I throw things out, I'm filled with anxiety. Absolutely, because we're creating too much garbage. And we're even shipping it from rich countries to developing countries, for example. I mean, we're in a crisis at the moment. So I don't know, Lola, if I've answered your question or just rambled on incoherently.
Oh, no, you have. Because I was actually my next point was actually going to be that there is no place for judgment. And we can see that in the characters' lives. Jacob and Eleanor keep and declutter. So Jacob doesn't really hold on to money, where others would hold on to money. He's like, I'm living for the moment. And Eleanor herself doesn't like the clutter of the books that Lawrence, has. And she judges Lawrence. But Lawrence is quick to say, hey, you can't judge me for my books. You have all your, pillows and stuff all over the place. So it's everyone is keeping something but at the same time, decluttering. Like even in the end, where we find out about what happens with Browning and Harriet's neighbor. Harriet's neighbor is keeping things, but she's also decluttering. So there's really no place for judgment. And I like that you concluded with that point, that it's a complicated subject, and I think that's one of the beauties of this book. It really helps you to understand why people do things the way they do them. Why is this important to you? I find it very fascinating that Harriet the one thing that Harriet, I think, would love to hold on to is the one thing that she does not get to keep, and that is her passion for words, right? And she's constantly
Yes.
trying to keep the words by writing out lists and things, and trying to remember things. And, you know, in mid-sentence, her words are taken away from her, and it's a really sad thing, and it helps us to understand why she lashes out the way that she does, why some people might consider her eccentric, but it's like you said, there's really no judgment. So
I think you nailed it. Harriet really wanted to keep her words,
yeah.
and her memory loss was her greatest loss.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And we're living in a world where more and more people face this.
Mm,
People are getting older and living longer lives, and this is a sort of a common experience, memory loss of this type, dementia.
yeah.
Yeah, I think it's my greatest fear, actually, of all the things that I wouldn't want to lose. It would be just that, my
Yeah.
words, my ability to remember.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And it's a very touchy subject,
Mm.
because our memories are the things that make us feel a sense of belonging. And so the book is also about belonging, and how even though we want to belong, we keep to ourselves in some way.
Mm.
And we see that very well in Jacob, Jacob and his partner, their lives. They're able to observe their neighbors through the windows of their condo, and see what this person is doing, and seeing this person, undress, and seeing that person, leaving out an ironing board and things like that. But when they actually see them in real life, there's a sense of mystery with them. Like, I know you, but I don't really know you, right? And we also
Yes.
see, when Jacob is on Instagram or wherever, he's sharing all these updates, but people don't really know Jacob. He doesn't really know people as well. And it's really quite sad, but we can see that just as we observe people on social media, we think we know them, we don't really know them. So there's this challenge of belonging, right? We have all this access to be able to see people, but what we get to keep from them is very little compared to who they truly really are. And I think that was very wonderful that you showed that very well in the book. And
Oh, thanks.
one more thing I also wanted to talk about was you unravel some really painful themes in the book when you talk about the conversations about being a parent. And all the parents in the book, Eleanor, Harriet, and Jacob's father, they're all struggling with raising their children and having these tough conversations that no one is quite prepared for, about before they become a parent or until they become a parent. And so as a parent myself, I'm curious to know how you were able to write about this. Did writing this book make you re-examine your own relationship with your children or your child?
Oh, yes. Being a mother and being a writer, both things at once, is a
Mm,
huge challenge, as you probably know, Lola.
yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And sometimes the two activities seem to be at war with one another,
Mm,
because what a writer really wants is a bit of time in solitude and time to reflect.
yes.
And that doesn't go well with the job of mothering.
Oh, no. Oh, no.
Absolutely. Um, but yes, I do explore the problem of motherhood in depth, particularly for Eleanor and for Harriet.
Yeah.
Harriet felt terrible guilt about shutting the door against her children,
Yeah.
and taking the time and space to write her poetry. And because of this choice she made, she lost one of her children.
Yeah.
I mean, and she blames herself and never recovers from it. So
Yeah.
that's her backstory.
Yeah.
And I took a long vacation from writing when I was a young mother. I was home staging instead and doing all sorts of different gigs, trying to make ends meet.
Yeah.
As we all do.
As we all do.
Yeah. And when I had a health crisis at the end of that period of time, I woke up in the hospital and I had this moment where I needed to change my life and do what really mattered most to me, and that was writing. And I remember my daughter was 6 years old at the time. Taking moments for myself to learn how to do it all over again was painful. She would get very angry at me. She would come up to my office and she'd stand in the doorframe with her hands on her hips. And she'd say, "Stop typing. Listen to me.
I'm talking to you."
Yes. Yeah, she was furious with me.
Yeah.
And, it was a constant negotiation. So I feel for Harriet, and being a mother and an artist, not an easy choice.
Yes.
And Eleanor too. Like, Eleanor is feeling suffocated in her life because she's the mother of 3 and possibly 4. Another one is possibly on the way. And she can't face it.
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, I think she's a pretty good mother.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I think so. I think she is as well. And it's, as you said, it's very difficult, that struggle to create. At the same time, be there for your child, because the very nature of the job of an artist is solitude. It's being by yourself, to be able to collect your thoughts. I mean, there's a part in the book where you show Harriet just sitting in her rocking chair, I think, and looking out. That is her way of making sense of her world. So like, just the very idea of being able to sit down and pause is so crucial. But at the same time, your child wants you. So it's this struggle to be able to be different things at the same time.
Right? Do you relate to this, Lola?
Absolutely. I mean, I can think of a certain child of mine who's always like, "I want you to play with me. Let's go hang out. Let's watch a movie together." And I'm like, "Child, I have 2 hours to work before my bedtime."
But I don't know, like, mothering is just so amazingly complicated, like everything.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, on the one hand, it's impossible to carve out the time you need to do your work. And yet on the other, there's so much you see so much happening in the world through your children. Yes. And you're watching a character develop, and the material there, I think, it inspires my creativity being a mother. So it's double-edged, right?
Yes, it certainly is double-edged.
Yeah. So I'm not going to say, just nasty things about mothering. It's been an amazing journey for me.
Yeah. It certainly is. I mean, like, you're right. It's double-edged. There are days where you're overwhelmed. Like, Eleanor at some point says, "I'm overwhelmed." And that's valid. I think it's also valid to be able, as creatives, to be able to identify when we're overwhelmed, and then to know when it's time to get up out of the bed, which she eventually does, right? So, that stood out to me. That really stood out to me as a mom. I was like, yes, somebody gets it.
Yeah.
So let's talk about something that was very interesting that happened between Eleanor and her husband.
Okay.
And this is the idea of the tragedy, actually, of losing something that's integral to us, and us not even recognizing that this thing is integral to us. So Lawrence one day decides to sell an antique book that he's had for years and years, because he wants to give his wife a treat and he can't afford it otherwise. And you would think that Eleanor would be happy that, he's gone to all this trouble to take her out and share this big news with her. But she's sad because she knows that he's just parted with a crucial part of himself. And yet she's the first person to complain about all these books that are lying around. And so I wanted us to talk a little bit about that, that sometimes there are things that we don't get to keep that are integral to us.
Yeah.
What was going on in your mind when you thought of that plot twist?
Oh, that came late in the day. My husband was outraged that Lawrence was, quote unquote, such a loser. And I was like, no, he's not. He loves his books, and I totally get it. And he was quite cross with me. He said, everyone's going to think I'm Lawrence, and Lawrence is such a loser. Anyhow, I wanted to show that Lawrence was growing as a character, and that he did have a moment of epiphany when all of those people were raiding his colleague's office and taking stuff. He was like, oh, this is awful.
Yeah.
And, people are more important than things.
Yes.
I think he had that moment of revelation.
Yes.
I wanted to show them connecting in a sort of mutually respectful way. I didn't want to sort of tie up the novel with too many bows, but that might have been one. Everyone wants to know what happened to Lawrence and Eleanor. Did they make it as a couple? And I like to leave it a little bit open-ended, but I think
they did.
Moving in. Oh, good. I think they're moving in a good direction.
Yeah.
And nothing's perfect.
Yeah.
And I think Lawrence did have a moment of epiphany, and he's suffered as well. He's having his own midlife crisis. He's questioning his choices. So, yeah, I wanted that to be the tender moment between them as a couple.
Yes, that certainly was tender. And I think just as we were talking about, sometimes admitting what the problems are, I think, sometimes couples need to have tough conversations, and I think when she does tell him, this is how I feel, this is how you can actually help me, instead of just saying, how can I help? This is how you can actually help me. And he gets this epiphany when, people come and raid his colleague's office. It helps him to see that, maybe I'm holding on to things I shouldn't, hold on to. Maybe there are things that are more important. And I love that you touched on that, because I think when I think about this book, I'm just going to hold it up one more time. And I think about this idea of keeping and losing things. I think the most important thing that I've taken away from this book is that the things that we're choosing to lose are the most important things. And I would say that is community. And I think that's what everybody fights for.
Yes.
You touch on something very, very important in Canada right now, and that's the housing crisis. Yes. And, some people are like, there are not enough houses, and some people want to keep the status quo, like Mrs. Fitzhugh, I think that's her name. And she's like, I want to keep the status quo. This is how I remember this neighborhood. This is how I remember this street. And I would like to keep this. I don't want to see a high-rise building right in front of me. And, and in a sense, she's trying to keep her community. But on the other hand, the developer is trying to create a new community, right? Yeah. And it's the harsh reality that sometimes the economy forces people to lose the important things and hold on to things that don't really matter, much like Lawrence selling his book to be able to give his wife a treat. So I was wondering if you wanted to share a little bit about that, about the things that are most important to us in community.
Yeah. Well, community and connection. I would say connection's really critical. And I think that we were discussing this briefly before we began. The problem of aloneness in today's society. It might be the great problem of our age, I think. And the antidote, of course, is connection and community.
Yeah.
And in various ways, all three characters, Harriet, Eleanor, and Jacob, are alone in the world. And yeah, I was definitely exploring this. People feel disenfranchised. People are literally without homes, they're
Yeah.
homeless.
Yeah.
And these are massive societal problems with the social fabric that we face in late capitalism, for sure. And what's really astonishing to me in terms of the homelessness crisis and the problem of consumption and waste is that we'd be building storage facilities, these big buildings that look like condos, and we're putting stuff in those buildings rather than people.
Yeah.
I mean, this is where we're at these days. And when it comes to keeping and maintaining community, we're challenged there as well. You and I are talking with a screen between us.
Yeah.
And we were saying how we'd love to do this in person, having a cup of coffee or tea or something, because that would feed us. That would, as two introverts, we'd be getting something nourishing and necessary that, you know, we still are, Lola. We're still connecting, but not
it's
quite as fully.
Exactly. I think there's a real connection, I guess, that you get when you are in a room or space with someone physically. So
But whenever my daughter is feeling a little bit lonely, she's a university student in Ottawa right now. I just tell her, leave your computer and go out and see someone, even if it means crossing the street and buying something from the grocery store and talking to the cashier. You know, this is the stuff that keeps us well.
Absolutely.
And in many ways, you know, this was Harriet's problem. She'd been living on her own for far too long, and that loneliness was dementing in the end. So it's fascinating that as writers, we need to be alone. And yet, on the other hand, if we spend too much time in isolation, it has bad effects on our well-being.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one thing that Miss Fitzhugh does very well. It's like she fights for community.
Yes,
you know, at the end of the day, in her own way. Like even when she's being this seemingly obnoxious person coming up to them and talking all the time, if you take a step back, you see that that's probably a cry for help. Like, hey, I'm going to be loud in your face today, but maybe I just want to annoy you so you can talk to me and I can have a dose of human connection today. So that I totally agree with that. And that just brings me to what I would call my last question, hopefully my last question, about geriatric care and the concern for the elderly, which is clearly very evident in this work. I mean, as someone who's worked as a homestager, you could have written about, you know, young people who've just been through a divorce, or a young widow, or a young widower, or anybody else, but you wrote about an elderly woman, and it leads me to think that there is a certain concern that you have for the elderly, or a certain passion that you have for the elderly, and I was wondering if you wanted to share a bit about that.
Well, yes, we're an aging society. I have elderly parents. In fact, I've just moved them into a retirement home, so I'm now living keep after the fact. My husband's parents are here in town as well, and they need our care. So I'm surrounded by the elderly. I'm particularly interested in old ladies. I love old ladies, and their capacity for creativity at the end of life astonishes me especially. Yeah, so many writers and artists achieve great things later in life. So women especially, I think, have a kind of have new opportunities, particularly once their children have grown and left. And so this inspires me, I guess, because I'm middle-aged, and I'm, in many ways I'm just beginning, you know. So yeah, I think I'm interested in people at all stages of life, though. So that's why I had three characters representing different generations. Jacob would be in his 20s, Eleanor's middle-aged, Harriet's elderly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I did see that, and then I love the fact that you made the story multi-generational. And it really helps to cement that point that we all keep and lose. We all struggle to find community. We all struggle to determine what's important. We all struggle to fight for that connection. So thank
Yeah.
you for this. I think that there's a way that as a writer you can be so engrossed, in one perspective, with one perspective. And I think the ability to be able to step back and say, how do we make this a multi-generational conversation is so wonderful and so inspiring as well, and instructive. So thank you for doing that.
Oh, I hope it wasn't instructive. I was just.
Well, I think it was instructive to me as a writer.
Oh.
Yeah, because like I said, sometimes when you have this idea, so let's say for instance, I'm writing a book about, so I am writing a book actually about infertility, and I've been focused on this woman and how it has impacted her. But maybe there's another story to it. Like, so it's a love triangle: the woman, her husband, and the husband's brother, who she ends up having an affair with. And maybe there is a conversation that needs to happen with all three people. And so that's why it's instructive for me, because I can tell the story from her perspective, but I can tell the story from three people's perspectives, and that would be a richer, fuller, more insightful story. So that's why it was instructive to me.
Well, I love that fiction gives us the opportunity to do that, to take on so many points of view if we feel that we want to, because there's no one truth. And so I did that in Keep. But I also love the first person point of view.
Yeah.
It's more sort of direct and intimate.
Yeah.
So I don't know. This was definitely a story for three perspectives.
Yes, and I think you did it so well. For me, there was no loophole. It was just so wonderful. And then with this being your debut novel, I'm just wondering how you navigated that aspect of things. Was this a difficult story to sell? What did the publishing process look like, if you could summarize that?
Okay. So as I mentioned, Lola, it took me forever to write this novel because I didn't know what I was doing, and I had to learn by doing it.
Mm-hmm.
But once I had a draft that I was really happy with, I did take it to an agent, and it went through another revision, and eventually it went out to publishers, and there was a lot of interest. And I think the subject matter itself, the staging, was what fascinated people. Frankly, yeah,
it definitely stood out to me.
Yeah, I don't think there are any other novels about home staging, because it's sort of an unusual combination of things to have somebody who's actually worked as a poet and a home stager.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah. So
Oh, thank you.
I think that publishers were quite interested in as I say, the subject matter.
Yeah, it definitely, like I said, when I was looking through the catalog, it stood out to me. I was like, oh, this is interesting. I've never heard of this before. And so I felt educated, but not like I was reading a textbook. It was really just, it felt like, oh, this is interesting. I didn't know that there were people who did this, and I didn't know how difficult it was for people to be able to pack up and have to leave. Like not that you want to leave, but you have to leave. And then there are people, sort of walking you through that experience. So I want to thank you for writing this book and shedding a light on something that I think is so important for people to know and to be aware of. And thank you for coming to chat with me today, Jenny.
Thank you so much, Lola. You've made me laugh. I'm so glad this wasn't like reading a textbook. So thrilled.
You're welcome.
Relieved, maybe. Okay. Well,
you're very welcome. Thank you.
It was lovely having this conversation. Have a great afternoon.
I will. You too. On the next episode, I'll be chatting with another inspiring artist. But before then, I'd love to hear from you. Tell me what you think about this show and this episode. Feel free to drop me a note here or send me a DM on Instagram at Journey of the Art Pod. Finally, please subscribe if you're watching this on YouTube, or follow and rate the show if you're listening elsewhere. Help me connect with other artists who need a dose of inspiration today. Until next time, stay on the journey of your art.